thank you for joining us for this important conversation. I agree with President Paxson that not only is this a timely discussion, but I believe that there is no more important discussion that we can have in our country and in our communities than one about the growing income inequality and the loss of opportunity. Thank you, President Paxson, for bringing us together in this way for this conversation. And I also want to say thank you for your leadership on our Urban Innovation Partnership and in everything that Brown has been doing to support our kids in the city of Providence. Thank you, John, for this work. It really is great to have you here in our city. I can tell you that this work has already influenced a lot of the work that we do around education, around housing policy, as we try to tackle social and economic mobility here in our city. So it's great to partner with you on this initiative. So I want to start off by sharing a little bit of my story that, at least to me, speaks to why this work is important, and then also add my perspective to the challenges that we see on the front lines as public policymakers, and perhaps add a little bit more nuance and complexity to what you all already have seen in John's presentation. So, my parents are immigrants. They came to this country from Guatemala, and they literally came to this country without a dollar, without a cent in their pockets. But they came here with hopes and dreams. If I had a dollar every time my mother told me that our path out of poverty was to get a good education, play by the rules, and get a good job, then we would already be bending this part upwards. So, my parents, they came from underdeveloped, quote-unquote, third world country. Very low formal education. My father has a 7th grade education, my mother has a 5th grade education. And it's the classic, yet also in so many ways, unbelievable immigrant story. My mother still tells me to this day that when she crossed the border from Mexico into Texas, that she spent 2 weeks in the desert carrying my 10-month-old sister. And I remember growing up and watching my mom, how she worked second shift throughout her entire life. In fact, today as we speak, my mother's still working second shift. On weekends, we would go to flea markets, we'd purchase blankets and curtains, and then drive around the neighborhoods selling them. We would also on weekends go around finding empty bottles and empty cans. We would take them to recycling centers for the deposit money. Everything that my parents could do to provide for my sister and I and provide for our life, they did it. And I find it hard to believe that there's anything necessarily intrinsic about them that made that drove them to continue and that drove them in their persistence that they needed to provide my sister and I a better life. But I have to believe that what's at the core, what's at the root of my family story, being one where we've lived the American dream, is that my parents never lost hope. Throughout all of our struggles and throughout my parents' entire story, they always believed that if you worked hard, you played by the rules, you got a good education, you could also live the American dream. And that's why it's so concerning to me, as you see John's presentation, that in the 1970s, 90% of people believed that, or 90% of young people would do as well as their parents by the time they reached middle age. And now, it's hovering around 50%. And so if we want folks to continue to believe that the American dream still exists, and continue to believe that there is hope for the next generation, then there has to actually be some substance there. I've heard it said very provocatively that if you are looking for the American dream, perhaps you should look in Canada. And so what are we doing here locally to make sure that that American dream still exists? So I want to add a piece from the world that I live in every single day to John's work. And that's that, and this might seem totally counterintuitive to anyone who knows me, but let me just say that I am very optimistic about the state of politics in our country, and I also believe that politics are moving in the right direction in our country today. Now let me explain. Certainly I think that, I lament and am deeply concerned about the state of politics in Washington. But what you see happening right now, and it is my belief, that you see a slow and steady rise of mayors and the influence of local leaders at a national level. In fact, there's a mayor running for president right now, something that has always been considered audacious, and he's a legitimate candidate. But his candidacy, in fact, is part of something much bigger. And whereas you see a retreat on so many issues that we care about at the federal level, you see mayors and municipal leaders stepping in and filling that void. A couple cases in point is take the Paris Climate Accord. This began as a multinational agreement where countries agreed to abide by these very specific terms. The federal government stepped back from its leadership role, and over 400 cities throughout the country stepped up and said that nonetheless we will abide by these terms. And in fact, cities throughout the country are the biggest polluters, and so we can still see many of the benefits that were initially envisioned for America's participation. And you go issue past issue past issue, and you see that cities and mayors are stepping up and leading the way. So social and economic mobility is also no different. Don't forget that only 7% of education funding comes from the federal government. The levers that move the needle on social and economic mobility, they live in our cities. When you think about our school systems, our libraries, our workforce development programs, our zoning ordinances, etc. They all live in our cities. And so I think that there is an opportunity here with the continued rise of the voice of mayors and the influence of mayors, that by coordinating our activities, that we can amplify each other's voice and lead the national conversation on many of these issues, including social and economic mobility. And even if those structural changes in our politics throughout the country don't come to pass, the leadership on this issue in particular is not coming from Washington, and it's also very difficult for it to come from the state level, and so it behooves us as local leaders to lean into it regardless. So I think that cities and municipal leaders have to play a leading role, and that's why it's so exciting to have this research that shares with us at a very local level how it is that we're doing. I can share with you that I talk with my colleague mayors throughout the country on a regular basis, and while we will all say that social and economic mobility is a great challenge and a great concern in our communities, being realistic, every mayor will also tell you that we simply don't know how our cities fare. We don't know how we fare now to how we did previously, and we also don't know how we fare now to how other cities are faring now. And what John's research is sharing with us, not only providing an answer to that, but also showing us at a granular level and down to the zip code how it is that we're doing. So just being aware of where we stand is going to have a deep impact on the way that we think and the way that we address these challenges. And so what are the ways that we're addressing these challenges here in Providence? Well, there's a great book called Dream Hoarders that is produced by a researcher at the Brookings Institution, and Richard Reeves. And what he does is he takes this massive challenge and he breaks it down into digestible chunks. Turns out that upper middle class families that sometimes even before their children are born, they're already signing up and getting in line for the best early childhood learning centers for their children. Also during the summertime, summer learning loss has been documented. It's a very real thing. Low-income students or children from low-income families, they're losing about 2 months worth of learning during the summer Whereas upper middle class children that come from families that can afford these summer enrichment programs, they're either staying level during the summer or actually moving a step further. So regardless of what we're doing during the school year, you multiply the summer learning loss by 12, and what you have is a massive achievement gap by the time that folks graduate from high school. Also, when it comes to internships, having that leg up, having that experience and that opportunity can make the difference of you knowing exactly which direction you want to follow in your career, but also having those doors open for you in your career. Whereas upper middle class families might be able to call their accountant, their attorney, or perhaps a family friend that can offer their child an internship in their offices or firms, lower income families just don't have that ability. So what we've done in the city of Providence, we've specifically addressed each one of those challenges. We have a program called Providence Talks, which is the only program at scale that's looking to close the 30 million word gap in the city of Providence. And we're hoping that through participation in this program, more of our kids are ready to learn by the time that they enter kindergarten. We've also invested millions of dollars in summer learning. And in fact, if there's one area that I am deeply, deeply optimistic about in education in our city, it's maximizing time on task and making sure that our children have the capacity to learn and grow, whether they're in a school building or outside in the community. Because the truth is that our kids spend only 20% of their waking hours inside of a school building. The other 80%, they're out in the neighborhoods and out in the community. But there's just as much time or opportunity for learning and growth in those spaces. However, when you look at the way that we allocate resources, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on the 20%, and we spend peanuts on the 80%. So how do we rebalance that so that it works better for our kids? We've been investing a great deal in summer learning. And then we've also invested millions of dollars over the past several years on summer internships. And these internships, they're sometimes at city offices, and sometimes they're at some of the biggest firms and companies in the city and in the state. And the way that we've structured them have been not only that we get a great experience and it's an enriching education for kids during their internship, but we also want to make sure that kids are leaving their internships with a mentor and a reference for the next opportunities so that they can start to not only open that door for themselves, but keep opening it even wider. We're also looking at housing policy, and this is an issue that's of great concern to the current city council and to my administration. And so we're working collectively, or we're working collaboratively, not only to create a housing trust fund to invest more in affordable housing and to create more housing options for our families, but we're always looking for ways through our zoning ordinance that we can provide for greater density and provide more housing opportunities for our folks. So those are some of the ways that we're beginning to tackle this here at the local level. But I remain convinced that whatever challenge whatever social challenge that we confront, that we can't simply think with a policy hat on. Many of these challenges that we have in our community, there is no technical solution to either one of them. What it relies on is making sure that there's a sense of community. And just as I mentioned, my family coming to this country, we didn't have much, but once we settled here in Providence in the 1970s, there was a growing Latino and a growing Guatemalan community that my family felt a part of. It felt as though we weren't entirely on our own, that if we fell on particularly acutely difficult times, that there were folks that provided, in fact, an informal social safety net for us. And the reason why I think that this conversation around social and economic mobility is perhaps the most important that we can be having today is because you all see it on TV and you see it throughout the country play itself out, where there's growing anger, there's growing division, there's growing anxiety, and you look at the rise of diseases of despair, such as depression, loneliness, substance abuse, and even suicide. People see much progress all around them, but they feel as though they're being left behind. How do we create a sense of community so that people feel connected to something bigger than themselves and give folks a sense of meaning and purpose in our collective lives. So that's part of the challenge that we have as well. And I'll simply underscore this point that I just mentioned. More and more, I'm convinced that there is no technical solution to the social challenges that we have unless there's a strong underpinning of a sense of community that brings people together. So I'll pause there. I want to thank President Paxson and John Friedman once again for inviting us and for having this conversation. I look forward to hearing what you all have in mind. Thank you.